1968 was to be one of America's most turbulent and traumatic years of the 20th century. An increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam raged on as more and more veterans went over to die. The assassination of Martin Luther King sparked riots across the country. Fear, anger, and distrust on all sides began overwhelming a nation, and in response, American cinema was beginning to change forever.
Misshapen monsters. Reaction of law enforcement officials is one of complete bewilderment at this hour. So far, we have been unable to determine that any kind of organized...
But it was one movie in particular, a micro-budget film shot in Pittsburgh by a man named George Romero and his friends, about everyday Americans returning from the dead as flesh-eating creatures called ghouls, that would capture the mood of the era like no other, change the zombie movie forever, and become one of the most important movies not just in horror, but in all of cinema. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the zombie movie, and we explore George Romero's game-changing masterpiece, Night of the Living Dead.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across several weeks. We are currently in the middle of exploring the evolution of the zombie movie, and this is part 4, in which, as the intro suggested, we are going to be talking about one of the biggies, the movie that changed everything, Night of the Living Dead from 1968. Now, this is your spoiler warning. If you haven't seen this, one of the most important movies in the genre, then please do go away and watch it, because we are going to be talking about this movie in depth. Every moment of this film is going to be covered all the way through to that iconic ending. So that is your spoiler warning. There is so much to discuss in this movie, so let's get started straight away. Joining me to discuss all things Night of the Living Dead, he was here last series discussing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with me, so it's fair to say he doesn't come on to do the sort of light, frothy films by any means. It's my absolute pleasure to have him back on the podcast from Total Film. Welcome back, Jamie Graham.
Hello, good to be back.
Lovely to have you back here. Last time you were here, it was like the height of summer, wasn't it? We were sweating in our little cupboard there, talking about... Felt very apt, really, considering we were talking about Texas Chainsaw. Now, equally so, it's like the dead of winter, and here we are again.
Now freezing, yeah.
Exactly. So, tell me, like this time around, we're talking about zombie movies. Are you a fan of these types of movies?
I am a fan of them in terms of I'm a fan of all horror movies and all movies full stop. So yeah, I'm a big fan, and there's a lot of zombie movies I have a great deal of time for, but to be perfectly honest, it's not my favourite. In terms of, if we're talking horror movies and subgenres, I prefer vampires. I probably prefer werewolves, although there's not as many of them. I prefer a good ghost story. But also, I think there's been such a proliferation of zombie movies in the last sort of, 10 years or so, and Walking Dead on TV, that I've kind of got to the point where I'm a bit sick of them. Every year you go to Fright Fest and there's, another 10 zombie movies. But having said that, despite saying I can get a bit sick of them, they always come along and surprise you. You'll watch 5 quite average ones or rote ones, and then someone somehow finds something new to say or a new way to do it, and they're the ones that really sort of impact still.
Definitely. It's weird, isn't it, that there has been such a kind of glut of them these last 10 years or so. What do you think it is? Do you think it's just that people think they're kind of easy and cheap to make or something, or what is the reason for the popularity of the zombie film, do you think?
I think largely it's what you just said, that they're cheap to make. That that's true of horror movies in general, that people say first time filmmakers go out and make a horror movie, just some kids in the wood or whatever. And I think with zombie movies, unlike say a werewolf movie where you need a Rick Baker or something to do a great effect, with a zombie movie you just need a bunch of mates and a bit of makeup, and everyone can do a sort of zombie shuffle, as we know. So I think that's partly it. And I think also it's just one of those genres that people are taken to their hearts and seem to really enjoy. Like, in terms of when you go to Fright Fest, there's always people dressed as zombies. There's always the big zombie walk. Yeah, right. And it sort of crossed over, but it started off, it was meant to be quite a disturbing genre, like the Romero movies, certainly. And yet people have kind of gone away from that, and it's become this fun thing in a way that people love zombies. It's just really good entertainment and fun.
How have you kept up with The Walking Dead? Do you still watch it?
I kept up with it till about half a season ago. So literally I got halfway through the latest season, and then I just thought I've had it.
It's literally everybody I've spoken to on this podcast has said that. They kind of go, I stuck with it to a point and then I've given up on it, and it does feel like people are losing patience with it. And maybe you're right, maybe it's just zombie fatigue we're getting or something. I don't know.
I think the last couple of seasons haven't been much, to be honest, but I've kind of stuck with it because I'd done the first few and I felt I had to, and then I just got to the point I was just like, no, I'm actually every week just forcing myself to watch this for an hour now. I've had enough.
And it's so miserable, and it feels a little bit... I think the thing that frustrated me about it was that it felt a bit directionless. It kind of just, totally. I guess by its very nature is that it does just kind of drift along. It just meanders along, really. And you kind of think, where is this going, if anywhere?
Yeah. And when it started to lose the focus, when it was Rick and he was very much a central character, I think it had something. And then, it got to a point where he was hardly in it for like one season or something. And it's just like you said, it just lost focus.
Yeah, very odd. Anyway, let's go back to when zombies were a fairly new revolutionary thing, I suppose. Then talking of Night of the Living Dead in 1968, I mean, this movie felt like it kind of changed everything, really.
I think so. I mean, it had been moving in this direction in terms of stuff like Psycho in 1960. Horror had been coming home, and it had been getting a bit more shocking with the shower scene and all of that, and the heroine dying half an hour in was really what's going on. So it had been moving in this direction, but I think 1968 Night of the Living Dead was very much the point where it was like, what the hell is going on? Like, all bets are off, that whole thing where most horror movies have a nice resolution. Whatever you go through, they come through at the other end. The heroes, you have something to cling on to, some hope. All of that went. Everything in terms of politics of it, the breakdown of society, the breakdown of the family, the bleakness of it, the nihilistic ending, the levels of gore with the flesh eaters, people never seen anything like it. Even watching it now, there's certain scenes in it I find quite grueling.
Yes.
Like, God knows what it was like in 1968. So I think it must have really been a case of being slapped in the face when you went along and saw that for the first time.
God, 100%. And it's still 50 years old. It still kind of carries its power, actually. Like you say, it still feels like a punch in the face to some extent, as you head towards the end. Just very broadly speaking then, like you said, we had a few examples of Psycho kind of pushing things along, but in generally speaking, what was the horror genre like, I suppose, kind of up until this point, would you say?
Well, I'd say most of the horror movies were, you still had the tradition of the kind of 1930s Universal monsters, but they were usually set in exotic climes. It was a bit of sort of, fantasy escapism. There was a certain poetry to it, or, eroticism and things like that. There were certain things to cling on to as a viewer that even though you were being scared, you were really being entertained as well.
Yes.
And then I think along came Night of the Living Dead, and then very soon after that, movies like Last House on the Left, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hills of Ice, and suddenly it was a whole new ball game where these movies were savage, they were raw, they were nasty, they were bleak, and it was really like being put through a mince grinder or something. So I think the whole genre changed massively.
Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead, the dead who live on living flesh. The dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the Living Dead.
Basically, the plot is really simple, that we just first meet in a graveyard, which is like a traditional horror movie setting, which we probably talk about how Romero sort of plays with conventions and then dumps them, dumps you on your head, as it were. But you start off with a brother and sister in a graveyard, and they're going to visit the grave of their dad. And while they're doing that, there's this shambolic figure in the background. And the brother, Johnny, says to the sister Barbara, like, oh, they're coming to get you, Barbara, and makes this joke that, you know, it's some sort of monster, some sort of ghoul coming together. Then, of course, it turns out to be true that this is the first one of the living dead that we see, Walking Dead that we see. He attacks them. Johnny tries to get in the way to protect his sister and gets killed, which, again, is a real shock because we think he's going to be the hero of the movie, and 5 minutes in, his brains are splattered on a gravestone. And then she kind of runs away and she finds this deserted farmhouse and decides to board up there and get away from these zombies, which again we'll talk later about, you know, zombies and how they're not actually in the film called zombies. But anyway,
amazing, right?
Yeah, it is amazing. Yeah. We'll come to that. And when she's there, she meets a black guy called Ben, who's very sort of resourceful, like hero figure, and he's there as well, you know, trying to escape. And together they hole up in this farmhouse. They're boarding it up, ready for the imminent attack. Barbara goes into a kind of catatonic state that she's not much good to anyone. She's just absolutely, like, you know, just horrified by what's happened to her brother, as she would be. And then the first half of the movie is a lot of talking and a lot of boarding up and the occasional zombie hand coming through a window. And then about halfway through the movie, you get a huge surprise that in the basement, there's actually 5 other people hiding out. There's a family, there's a husband and wife and their young daughter, and there's 2 young lovers also in the basement, and they come up. And then the second half of the movie, you've got a lot of bickering, a lot of squabbling about, you know, whether they should hide in the basement, whether they should hide on the ground floor so they can escape. There's a lot of sort of alpha male bullshit going on.
Yeah, right.
And then the zombies attack various times. They try to escape at one point, zombies attack again, and then it all leads to the most sort of horrifying ending, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I know, that's it. And there's all of those moments you just mentioned I want to talk about, and we'll get through as much as we have time for. You tend to join me, we talked about this before, but you tend to join me for the movies that I feel like I have the most I want to ask about and the most I want to discuss. There's absolutely so much to unpack in this movie. We could be talking for hours, but we'll keep it as succinct as we can. First of all, I want to ask you, Jamie, are you a fan of this movie? I mean, what was your earliest memory of watching it, and what was your reaction to it?
I am a huge fan of this movie, to the point it's probably my favourite zombie movie. Is between this, I Walked with a Zombie, and Dawn of the Dead. Yeah. But if I had to choose, I'd probably choose this. But my earliest memory of seeing it was probably in the mid-80s when I was a teenager. I became a massive horror fan, and I was sort of watching all the stuff that was coming out then, like, you know, Near Dark, Nightmare on Elm Street 3. We're talking about 86, 87. Yeah. And a few older films like Carrie in the 70s and stuff like that. And then basically, as I started to widen my tastes and get more into the horror genre, obviously one of the titles you have to see is Night of the Living Dead. It kept popping up as this like iconic horror movie. So I bought it on VHS video. Now, the only VHS video of it available at that time was the colorized version.
Oh, right.
Yeah, which I don't know if you've ever seen, but it is horrendous.
No, do you know what? I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Romero basically gave his consent for it to be colorized just so the people who made the film would finally actually get a bit of profit and a bit of money back, because they never really had. Yeah. So anyway, it came out colorized and everyone had sort of day glow hair, you know, a bit like Donald Trump or something. And it was, you know, this was before colorization got good, you know, it really did look awful. And so I watched it for the first time like that, and I've got to be honest, I thought, well, what's all the fuss about? I don't really get this. And I watched it a couple more times and it was okay. And then I came up with a bright idea. I say bright idea rather sarcastically, because anyone else would have thought of this immediately, that I could watch it in black and white by turning the dial on my TV, because this is back in the day in the 80s where you did your own colour with the knob, and I turned it so it was actually black and white, and it immediately became far more effective and evocative. And then over the years, it's just grown for me that every time I watch it, it's just like, shattering experience now.
Really is. That's a brilliant answer. Well, let's get into that then. What I was going to do was kind of go through the movie almost chronologically, and we'll pick apart sort of different elements of it as we go. And I guess that's the first thing I should ask you about is the black and white, the cinematography. I mean, the first image we see is this kind of stark black and white, this car coming down this road, this graveyard, these American flags. I mean, generally, what is it about the look of this movie? What do you think? Why is it that the black and white works for this movie, would you say?
But it works because for some reason we've always believed, and I think it's because newspapers through the years and documentaries and newsreel footage, black and white means veracity, it means authenticity. And even though the world is obviously in colour and we see in colour, we believe that black and white for some reason is authentic. So when you watch this movie, rather than be a slice of escapism like we spoke earlier with Transylvanian castles and stuff, it really feels almost documentary-ish in places, it's got that real vibe. And it's not that kind of lovely luminous black and white that you get on old Hollywood pictures, with the high production values. This is quite grainy. It was actually shot in 35mm, but it does look like a kind of 16mm film. It's got that grittiness to it. But the interesting thing is they only shot it in black and white. It was more of an economic decision than anything else, that they could do it cheaper. And they were a week into shooting and actually managed to get a bit more funding from somewhere, and then stopped and said, shall we scrap the first week and shall we start again and do it in colour? And the only reason they didn't do that was, one, they just didn't want to lose that first week, and two, that if they went in colour, which they could now afford, but they could only afford it in 16mm colour, and then they'd have to blow it up to 35mm colour for its release, which would cost more money. So just the brass tacks of it, just the the money side of it, was no, we'll carry on in black and white, but it worked so well.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I suppose that must be the case with so many movies. These artistic decisions, quote unquote, are usually practical reasons, aren't they? Especially with kind of low budget films like this. I guess it must have been fairly unusual and fairly untrendy at this point in the 60s to still make films in black and white almost, didn't it?
Well, it was, I mean, basically in the 60s, colour had late 50s and 60s, colour had kind of overtaken everything, to the point that 2 years before Night of the Living Dead came out, the Academy had actually got rid of their black and white cinematography award, which they'd always had up to then, because people weren't making black and white movies anymore.
No. It felt like
even when Hitchcock made Psycho in 1960, that was quite rare then to have a black and white movie, let alone 68.
It's so interesting. And you're right, I think there is something in our brains that tells us when it's in black and white that it almost feels documentary-like in some weird way. And this is something we talked about with Texas Chainsaw as well, that kind of documentary visual style that this has. Interesting, I saw you tweeted actually, so the frequently asked questions about the movie on IMDb, one of them being, is this a true story? Which is just brilliant. But there is something about the way this film looks that almost makes you believe that, isn't there? It's so good.
Yeah, there is, as it goes on, because it's really interesting that Romero starts off, he's almost setting you up to think you're watching a traditional horror movie, but the opening scene is in a graveyard, which we're so used to seeing, and the acting, the two actors, Barbara and Johnny, in the opening scenes, they look like sort of daytime TV soap.
They do,
stars in the way they dress, the way they talk, they're slightly stilted.
Well, there's no one around.
Well, it's late. If you'd gotten up earlier.
Oh, look, I already lost an hour's sleep on the time change.
I think you complain just to hear yourself talk. There it is.
And the score is also very kind of traditional, and you kind of think, oh, I know what we're doing here, I've seen this movie a million times, and I think he did that very much on purpose, that then when it goes on this journey and gets bleaker and bleaker and more gory, until they're chomping on flesh in close-ups and stuff like that, then it just catches you completely unawares.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that there is this, I think that's why this film I always think of as this almost transitional film, when we talk, Texas Chainsaw Massacre feels so we're in another world now from the old classics, but this movie, like you say, it has that kind of old-fashioned score. It almost reminded me of Hammer or Universal or something, the music, and it's this interesting mix of kind of old meets new or something, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think Romero's definitely playing on that. He knew what he was doing. I don't know if he did it to make some sort of statement or if he just did it to kind of just because it'd be more effective to catch viewers unawares and bang them over the head. Probably the latter. Yeah,
absolutely. And so George Romero, I mean, let's talk briefly about him, because I don't think we've actually really talked about him or his movies yet on this podcast. I mean, George Romero, who was George Romero and what kind of a director was he, would you say?
But basically, he grew up in Pittsburgh, and he went to the Carnegie College of Technology, and he dropped out halfway through that and was like not doing that anymore, and started I think it was called Latent Image. Him and a couple of friends started like this production house with George's uncle gave them something like $500 to start it up, and they were going to do commercials and, you know, just try and make a living making little movies like that. And they started off, they did a few wedding sort of videos, and they did baby pictures, and the first money they ever got in, actually, they got a check for something like $1,000, and they bought a pet monkey for the office actually with it. Apparently, yeah, to like have a good time. But anyway, that's by the by. And anyway, so they started making these commercials, and they started getting more and more work. And if you actually watch, I think it's the Millennium edition of Night of the Living Dead, you can see a lot of the commercials he made in the early 60s on that, and they're really interesting. And where it's interesting is he was learning his craft, and like, you know, making commercials, you're telling a story in 30 seconds, so it's the editing's there, and like George Romero edited Night of the Living Dead, and it is very, you know, it's got this sort of aggressive nature to it. It's assaultive.
This happens every 27 minutes in America. Sounds like some underdeveloped country, doesn't it? Regrettably, it's right here at home. Every 27 minutes, a black child dies. The past and present administrations were and are aware of this situation.
You know, I think a lot of that comes from his background, and again, the sort of documentary feel, because he made those kind of things as well. So that's where he came from.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I always find it interesting. I saw in a documentary recently him saying that his first idea of a film he wanted to make, he wanted to do something a bit arty, and he wanted to do something a bit Bergman-like. And, you know, and I found it interesting that obviously you got Wes Craven a couple of years later doing the same thing. It's like all of these filmmakers kind of known in a lot, you know, from a lot of people's perspective as being these quite schlocky directors, you know, were inspired, but they were really intelligent guys that wanted to make something truly artistic, weren't they? That's the thing. Yeah,
I think Romero and his producers, you know, when they started off making Night of the Living Dead, they said, one of them said anyway, that they wanted to make, you know, like the great American movie. That's what they really wanted to make, and they couldn't.
They did.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the ironic thing. But they didn't have the money. They didn't have, you know, just the means to do it. So they ended up, like we said earlier, what can you do for no money? You can make a low budget horror movie with a group of your mates, and like the people who were funding the film, you know, acted in it as zombies and stuff, and you know, they did their own makeup. George Romero actually did a lot of the background zombies, which were just mannequins with ping pong balls cut in half as eyes. And I think he made some joke about, you know, they're the really slow zombies in the background and all of that. So yeah, that's what you do with the money. And then quite ironically, it turned out that, like you say, maybe he did make the great American movie.
I think he did, didn't he? Yeah, amazing. What a legend that guy was. You had the pleasure of meeting him and interviewing, didn't you? Is that right?
I met him a couple of times over the years. The first time was on Land of the Dead, that I was lucky enough to go over to Toronto on set of. And it was actually one of those experiences where I was watching him shoot a couple of scenes all night, and I interviewed various actors, Dennis Hopper and people. And George Romero was so busy directing, he couldn't talk to me or any of the other journalists there. So it was absolutely gutting. It was like, oh, God, you know, he was one of my heroes. And then quite by chance, the next morning, as I was preparing to leave for the airport, I was in the hotel lobby, and I was clutching my copy of Dawn of the Dead DVD that I'd just bought. And like a new special edition, and the lift doors open and George Romero walked out, and I just thought, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do it. I went up and said hello. I was on set last night. He signed my DVD, and he was absolutely lovely. And then over the years after that, basically I probably interviewed him 2 or 3 times on the phone, and emailed him a few times, like when Total Film did a poll of the greatest horror movies ever made, and we got lots of famous people to take part. George Romero, I emailed him, he immediately got back, sent his top 10. He was always very talkative, and just like you've heard a million times, you know, I haven't got any new stories, but he was just an absolute gentleman who would always give you his time, was just a very sort of calm, placid kind of guy.
So it's wonderful, isn't it? And yeah, he always comes across that way in interviews I've seen of him and archive and that kind of thing. And again, there's something about this school of this generation of filmmakers, Wes Craven, Toby Hooper, these people who have the reputation as making these monstrous films. David Cronenberg, they seem like the kind of nicest, gentlest people you could meet as well, you know, which is what's wonderful.
Which probably says a lot, doesn't it, about in terms of cathartic, get it out your system.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And you're right, I think in some ways, you know, Night of the Living Dead could be considered one of the great American movies. It's very much an American movie, and we see at the beginning there, that opening scene, already you're getting these American flags. You're getting modern day America, not Gothic Transylvania or whatever it might be. Just briefly, and this is probably something we could cover for hours, but what was the kind of backdrop? What was going on in America at this point? What was happening in the real world that may have kind of partly inspired this movie, I guess?
Well, it was very much the Age of Aquarius, a kind of counterculture thing going on. And this movie kind of ties into that it's quite anti-military, that they're just totally ineffective, that, no one can beat the zombies. The zombies are taking over everything. In America at the time, there was obviously all of the race riots in Detroit and stuff a year before, the National Guardsmen being called in. And again, you can see that in the movie with the posse going across the countryside, killing, burning, all of that. And that also brings to mind Vietnam, which was the other big thing and was being beamed into countries, into TV, into living rooms, that you have the posse clearing up bodies on the meat hooks at the end, which again happened in Vietnam, and sort of chucking them onto the fire to burn them and all of that. So it really does key into all of that. And despite the fact it's anti-military and the youth culture did go for this film and they embraced it, it's quite interesting that I think it's also got that feeling of when all of that soured as well with the Manson family and things like that, because family falls apart in this, love doesn't work in this, nothing works. It's not just the military, it doesn't work. It's just like such a bleak movie.
It really is, isn't it? It's almost like family is their undoing in some cases, I think, as well, which I find interesting later on. And it feels like there was this point in time, and you see this in other movies reflected, where it's like the older generation are almost scared of the young people, and you see that reflected in a lot of these kind of Exorcist or Omen or any of those types of movies you get. And then you get the opposite, where it's like these young people are scared of the government, they're scared of the people running the country, they're scared of the military, and there's just kind of fear and turmoil on all sides almost, isn't there? And you definitely get
it's a maelstrom.
And it all comes into play in this movie, I think, where you get this kind of old versus new, young versus old. It's really interesting. So Barbara and her brother then, like you say, they've got an interesting sort of the dialogue I find quite interesting in this movie, because there's something, like you say, a bit TV drama about their performances, but the dialogue throughout this whole film is almost quite, again, mundane and everyday, isn't it? They just talk a lot about like how long the journeys are, or what they're whatever. It feels like, again, almost maybe that's what adds to the kind of almost documentary or real life feel of it or something. But I felt like that going all the way through the film, kind of long conversations about boarding up windows or hiding in the cellar and that kind of thing. It's that
sort of mundane nature of it that does give it that authenticity, but it's not sparkly, witty dialogue, sort of Hollywood champagne dialogue, Jimmy Stewart, all of that. It's just very much ordinary people squabbling. And this kind of runs through all of Romero's zombie movies, that probably even more dangerous than the zombies themselves are the human beings, because they just cannot get on, they can't agree on anything. There's so much bickering and infighting, stabbing in the back, and they kind of bring their own undoing in a way.
Yeah, right, definitely. And I think maybe that's going back to the beginning of what we said, maybe is the problem with some zombie movies, and the thing that a lot of zombie filmmakers miss is that it's often not about the zombies, I suppose, is it? And with Romero's, it really doesn't seem to be so much about the zombies or the ghouls.
No, very much so.
Johnny!
You're still afraid.
Stop it now, I mean it.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
Yeah, I want to talk about that iconic line, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." I think it was on the Birth of the Living Dead documentary. They were saying, was this the first ever instance of postmodernism almost in film? Again, it's this kind of feeling of like old horror, being kind of almost pastiched or referenced, and we're in a new age now or something. It feels like that, doesn't it? Again, kind of revolutionary in that regard.
It does, but it had happened before that, going right back to Universal, like something like Bride of Frankenstein in 1935 is very much a postmodern horror movie. And then you had, Orville Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
Very true.
It was all very, very knowing. And then you had Targets by Peter Bogdanovich that sort of clashed the two ideas of Boris Karloff plays a kind of, old movie horror icon kind of thing.
Yes, that's right.
And then that's clashed against the new American Nightmare, which is this like teenage sniper, which is very modern and nasty and just believable. And, those things really were going on in America at the time, and much more so now, unfortunately. So you did have these films before. It wasn't the very first to do it, but it still did feel, fresh. And like you say, but it was very much playing on those things of like, we're coming to get you, Barbara. It's like, oh, this is going to be a really hammy old horror movie.
Yes.
And then it's not at all, but he's kind of making a comment on that. And he's...
Yes, you're right. Because again, it's like you say, it's in a graveyard. It's kind of like we think we know what's coming, and then it totally kind of wallops us. And that we get this zombie, just this one zombie at this point, and that's all we see. Let's talk. We've only talked about zombies for a couple of weeks, and we've talked about the kind of old sort of Haitian voodoo zombies, I suppose. We've done I Walk with a Zombie and White Zombie, and we've done Plague of the Zombies, the Hammer film. Amazing films, but actually not at all really what we think of anymore as zombies almost. Did we? I mean, do you think that George even... like you say, doesn't even call them zombies. Was he even thinking of this as a zombie film, do you think, at this point?
I don't think he was. He was just thinking of it as, bringing the dead back to life.
Yeah.
And, his first draft of the script was completely different. It, had aliens bringing them back to life or something like that. And it was very much a horror comedy. They're never called zombies in the film. They're called ghouls. They're called flesh eaters. They're called those things, all of that. It's not zombies. I don't think he really saw them as zombies. He probably saw them more as like cannibals and... anything else.
Zombies to me were, those boys in the Caribbean who, do the wet work for Lugosi. And I thought I was creating a completely new monster. The neighbors suddenly turned into flesh eaters, ghouls, and that's what I called them, ghouls in the film. And I thought they were completely new.
But it did totally rewrite the rules, and it became the modern day zombie. These like, mad for brains, flesh eating, like killing machines, shambling along, bits falling off them. And it did really much change everything.
It did. That's briefly, I want to ask you about the portrayal of the zombies in this. I mean, is it kind of, obviously this was something new, the kind of the living dead American zombie, I suppose. How do they look now, 50 years on? I mean, do you still have they evolved much since Night of the Living Dead, I suppose, or are these still the zombies we very much know?
I think they're still the zombies we know. I mean, you have different instances, like when the Italians got in the game in like the late 70s and 80s. I think they took the makeup to the next level. When you see like Lucio Fulci films and stuff like that, the zombies, you kind of look at them and want to vomit, just in terms of just how realistic the kind of rotting flesh is, and the maggots and entrails and all of that. But I think zombies today are pretty much what Romero came up with. I mean, of course, nowadays the thing is there's a lot of fast zombies, which kind of started back in 1980 with, I think it was Nightmare City, Umberto Lenzi. That was the first one that I know of that had fast zombies. And then you had, like, in 1985, Return of the Living Dead. You had in Life Force, there's kind of zombies who are fast. And then obviously Danny Boyle, although he calls them the infected, not zombies. He's very snobby about it, but in 28 Days Later... but now they're kind of de rigueur. It is very much, fleet-footed zombies.
Yeah, you're right. And there's something. These ones are a little bit more murderous in some ways, aren't they? Like that first zombie we see, the way he is really trying to get into the car, and when Barbara's kind of trying to escape, there's something a little bit more. I don't know. They're a little bit less brain dead, especially that first zombie feels like,
Yeah, very much. I mean, talking of that first zombie, it's interesting because in the script, George had very much said that they're slow-moving kind of creatures, that they're dying. Well, they're dead, basically, so they're not going to be sprinting around. Yeah. But in that first scene, that ghoul in the cemetery, he is quite fast. He sort of runs around the car, he picks up a stone, he's smashing the car window quite fast and quite aggressively, and he actually smashes a window, and it's a real window. It's not like sugar glass, so that shows he's really giving it some oomph. And I think it was just a case of they said whatever works. You know, when you see it later in the film, there are certain zombies that are really shambling that you could sort of break into a jog and you'd leave them in distance.
Yes.
So I think it is a bit of a cheat in a way, but it's just what works for what scene. But
totally. And it's not really a cheat, I suppose, if he's the one that's coming up with it. I mean, he is making the rules at this point, right? And he's just saying, well, the dead are coming back to life and they're going to kill you in whatever way they can.
Yeah, very much so.
Depending on how long they've been dead or rotting, I suppose, at this point, or how capable they are of moving.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did find that interesting. You don't see a lot of zombies these days, pick up a rock or use tools to help them break into a house or a car or whatever.
They tend to be more dim-witted than that, a lot of them.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you said about these being the murderous ones as well, because obviously in the old films they were very much sort of spellbound voodoo slaves, they were just shambling along. And when they became like murderous creatures, I mean, George has said that one of his main influences on this film was Last Man on Earth, which was based on I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And even though that was kind of vampire creatures, it's very, very similar. It's that idea of an apocalypse. There's one man left standing and he's sort of fighting off these vampires. Yes. And they've caused this apocalypse by, spreading it through aggressive behaviour, biting, all of that. So that's when I think it began to turn to become this murderous thing. I think George took that. He took various other things like Plague of the Zombies, the Hammer film with the famous graveyard scene where they all resurrect, which is amazing.
Definitely there's a bit of Romero zombie in that.
Definitely. Carnival of Souls, I think, is another influence that he's really talked about. And he took all of these and then a lot of stuff he came up with himself and he threw it all in a melting pot and invented the modern zombie.
Stop global warming. I'm dead. I thought it ended the loop, but I'm back. Oh my God. Everything's different. This time, it's coming after all of us.
Some of the more perceptive of you might have just realised that was not a clip from Night of the Living Dead, but actually a clip from brand new horror movie out in cinemas right now, Happy Death Day 2 You, the sequel to, of course, the hugely popular Blumhouse movie Happy Death Day. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to plug our Patreon page, because this week patrons will be treated to a bonus episode in which me and Anna Wilczek will be discussing Happy Death Day and Happy Death Day 2 in depth, in spoilerific detail. That's both the first film and then the second film. So any fans of those movies, and I think there are quite a lot of fans of those movies, if you donate your $5 per month and sign up to the Patreon page, you will be treated to that bonus episode, as well as a load of other stuff. We're also going to be bringing you an in-depth review of the new film by Nicholas Pesky. He's the director of Eyes of My Mother, if anyone saw that from a few years ago. Absolutely terrifying. He's got a new movie out called Piercing, starring Mia Wasikowska. Did I pronounce that right? I always forget. Mia Wasikowska. He's got a new movie out and we will be discussing that at depth as well. There are a whole bunch of other Patreon episodes available at the moment, including a recent mailbag episode in which I answer a whole load of listener questions, some really interesting ones about horror movies in general, questions about the podcast, about the next series that we're going to be covering. I suggested what I'm thinking I would quite like to do next series, and some of the patrons have given me feedback and sound quite keen on the idea, so that's really good to know. So if you want to be involved and you want to support the podcast and everything we do here, then you can simply go to patreon.com/evolution of horror, and if you donate $5 a month, you will be treated to bonus content. You'll be sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if you're UK based, and you will also have an opportunity to get discounts on merchandise, which I promise you will be coming very soon. And on that note, I want to say a big thank you to all of the new patrons who signed up in this last week and donated their money. So a huge thank you to Dylan Wass, Alex Seeley, Tim Matthews, Nick Sheridan, Becky Orman, Sarah Grant, Richard Hector Jones, Philip Carr, Graham Blunt, Gats, Ian Lucas, Sebastian, Alex Ailing, Guy Thomas, Alex Matheson, and Chris Sav. A huge thank you to all of those people for donating. And once more, if you would like to become a patron of the Evolution of Horror and support everything we do here, go to patreon.com/evolution of horror. Now, back to our discussion of Night of the Living Dead. as the story progresses, then Barbara ends up in this house, which is where we spend the rest of the movie now, literally in the confines of this house. I mean, just briefly, I just want to ask you about the production design. I mean, obviously, it must have been probably, I imagine, somebody's house, probably knowing George, and he worked with what he could, did he? But again, I guess there's something that works about this because it's an everyday sort of domestic space.
What it was actually Romero and his producers did hire it off someone. It was someone's house, and I think they were paying quite a lot given their budget. It was something like £3,000 a week or $3,000 a week, which is a big wedge of their budget. But the reason they chose this particular house was that it was going to be demolished anyway, so the owner said you can have it and you can do what you want with it, which is why inside they can hammer up boards and knock down doors and break floorboards or whatever they want to do.
It's all right. Don't worry about him. I can handle him. Probably be a lot more of them as soon as they find out about us.
And then we're introduced to Dwayne Jones's character, Ben. We've got to touch briefly on this, on the casting of Dwayne Jones. Again, sort of feels like, obviously, a very revolutionary thing. In some ways, still today, it's quite an unusual thing, I think, that he is a black man and it's never once mentioned or even acknowledged that he is a black man, right?
Yeah, and the reason that is, interestingly enough, is it wasn't written as a black man, as I'm sure you know, that the original script, they just had it. They didn't mention the race. They probably presumed it was going to be white. It was going to be a truck driver who was going to be quite a sort of coarse type hero. And then they cast Dwayne Jones, and he came along, and because of what he was like as a person, that he was an intellectual, he was an academic, he was very sensitive, they allowed him to kind of change the character to fit it, so you no longer had this sort of macho hero in the role. And the reason it doesn't talk about race at all is because they just cast him, and the way George Romero was he just didn't think in those terms. He was very much like, it doesn't matter, who plays this part. They just match it to who they are. So the interesting thing is, you look at films that had black heroes in it before Night of the Living Dead, like Hollywood films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the Defiant ones, they were very much overtly about race. That was the topic, so it was being discussed, etc. That was the big kind of message or theme of the movie. Whereas here, it sort of percolates underneath. It can't, how can it not? But it's not a subject of discussion. He's just a black hero, that's it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's so right, because Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, I think the movie that probably would have won the Oscar earlier that year would have been In the Heat of the Night as well. Yeah. So you had these kind of Sidney Poitier heroes that were still in some ways quite safer, I suppose, in a way, because they would still, they're almost told from a kind of white perspective, I suppose, a lot of the time, weren't they? Whereas this did feel like something different. And it's that classic thing that we critics, how much are the kind of subtext actually intended by filmmakers in so many of the classic movies? And George swears blind that he never meant to say anything about race. That's right, isn't it?
He does, yeah. The other stuff, I think he fully meant, like the sort of Vietnam parallels, the National Guard parallels, all of that. He's definitely making certain statements. I don't think there's any doubt the reason at the start of the film, when his director credit comes up, which is a graveyard scene, as a Stars and Stripes, in that shot, he's making a commentary on modern day America. But the race side, he really says, was just by accident, that he didn't mean that. And I kind of believe it. And the whole thing about him, what I just said, that he is who he is and he just didn't think in those terms. I think, again, if you go back to those commercials he made for Latent Image in the early 60s, it's really interesting. Watch them on the DVD, and a lot of them have black actors in it as well. They have white and black actors sort of selling products like barbecues, whatever, And that was very, very unusual for the time. But again, it was just because George didn't think like that. He was just like, cast who I want. That's it.
So interesting. Yeah, so interesting. But of course, we as viewers, especially when you're kind of looking at it critically, you can't help but think about that all the way through. And, there's this, when he first appears, Barbara looks physically scared of him. And I wonder whether that's any of that is played into it, or whether or not it's got anything to do with his race. Maybe it's just because of what she's just been through. Maybe it's a bit of both. I don't know.
I think it's a bit of both. She's obviously just seen her brother get his brains smashed out, so she's obviously a tad nervous, you could say.
She's in shock.
But I think the race definitely plays into it, because whatever George says that he didn't mean it, Dwayne Jones was very, very aware of it. He himself, and George Romero went on record many times saying this, that he had a constant dialogue with George about worrying about certain things. Like there's one scene in the film where he has to strike Barbara, that she's a bit hysterical, and he has to strike her and knock her unconscious. And he said to Romero, like, are you sure you want me to do this? There's going to be riots. If a black man hits a white woman, it's going to erupt.
And especially for him as an actor, that must have been a really scary thing for him to have to do, because the backlash would have been against him, I imagine,
Absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
But the other really fascinating thing to this, though, is in the film towards the end, he actually has to kill the other sort of alpha male, Harry, who's a nasty bit of work. And he has to kill him not once, but twice. He kills him when he's a human being, because he kind of has to. Harry's causing all sorts of problems. And then Harry comes back as a zombie, and he has to kill him again. And again, you might think, that's really dodgy, a black man killing a white man, like you said, in the heat of the night, something like that. All that was being discussed. But when that scene happened in the theatres, apparently the audiences cheered, and they absolutely loved it, which is great. Maybe a sign of attitudes were changing.
How everything was changing, because nothing to do with colour, just about this is the hero and this guy's the dick, basically, who deserved to die. Let's talk briefly about all of those other characters then. So it's revealed kind of quite a way in, isn't it? That
it's a real surprise.
A whole other group of characters in the basement. And again, I think this is something, you've already mentioned it, Romero's films, they often don't have the most likeable characters, do they? I mean,
they don't.
They're not particularly a likeable bunch that we particularly sympathise with, are they, these other characters?
No, they're not. I mean, Tom and Judy are this sort of young couple, and they're just quite conventional kind of movie staples, really. I don't think you really feel for them. You don't really feel anything.
No.
And then the other characters are Harry and Helen Cooper, who are the married couple, and their young daughter, Karen, who's been bitten. I mean, we find her, she's down in the basement, and she's kind of been bitten by what turns out to be a zombie, and then she obviously inevitably comes back towards the end, which gives us some of the best scenes in the movie, which I'm sure we will talk about.
Can't wait.
But Harry and Helen Cooper, are just horrible married bickering couple, and Harry particularly is just such a nasty bit of work, And a lot of the movie is just Harry and Ben arguing, like, should we go down in the basement, which Harry wants to do. He wants to sort of cower away in there. And Ben wants to stay on the ground floor and board it up, because then if the zombies do get in, they can maybe escape rather than being trapped in the basement.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. It's like what we were saying, what would you do? And so much of this film is about that. There is a huge chunk of this movie, it feels like, where it is just characters bickering about where to hide, where to go, what to do. Before even much action happens, there's a lot of that, isn't there? Of just people arguing about the most ridiculous, stupid things. And again, there's this real feeling of sort of battling men, I suppose. Who's the alpha male here or something?
There really is. There really is.
We gotta fix these boards.
You're crazy. Those things are going to be at every window and door in this place. We've got to get down into the cellar.
Go down in your damn cellar. Get out of here!
Tell the people, for God's sake, to get
I'm taking the girl with me.
You leave her here. Keep your hands off her. And everything else that's up here, too. Because if I stay up here, I'm fighting for everything up here. And the radio and the food is part of what I'm fighting for. Now, if you're going down the cellar, get.
And it's interesting in the film that, Tom and Judy, the couple, they both get eaten, which we'll talk about later. But that's probably the most sort of gross out scene in the movie, when in close-up you see them get sort of devoured with like slippery flesh and intestines being chomped upon. Johnny actually comes back and breaks into the house and gets Barbara, his sister. And then you've got Ben has to kill Harry twice, as we've talked about. And then the little girl, Karen, she eats her mother. Well, she eats her father, who's now dead. You see her like chomping down on his arm, which is now half missing, and she kills her mother. So it's wonderful in terms of like, there's no sort of love or...
No.
And it's just, they all turn on each other, and everyone gets gets their comeuppance.
It's like you say, it's almost a fuck you to the nuclear family setup, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, you know, all of these characters, Dwayne is, you know, Ben is the last character left. I know he doesn't make it either, but he's the last character left, and he's the only one without any familial ties out of all the other characters. You know, the others, in some ways, their relationships with the other are their downfalls. So, you know, Tom and Judy, who go out there to help each other, and one gets stuck in the car, and that's kind of what causes their death. And Barbara and her brother, and obviously the whole Cooper family. Yeah, it's really interesting. Whereas Ben is the only one who's like a lone wolf.
But the thing with Ben as well, but it's fascinating that he survives the night until he gets shot, which we'll talk about. But he survives the night from the zombies by finally being forced down into the basement. So that's the other thing you've got, that Romero's hero of the movie, actually, when everyone does what he says to do and they stay on the ground floor, everyone ends up dead. And then when he has to do what he didn't want to do and go down in the basement, he survives the night. So that's another sort of fuck you to conventional American narrative.
It's so true. Harry was right, basically. Yeah.
That dick was right all along. Yeah.
It's amazing. And that's it. It's just the kind of pointlessness of it all, isn't it? I mean, it's like you say, there's no kind of moral, there's nothing there that is like, yeah, you know, if you do this, you'll be in the right and you're good and you're, you know, there's nothing. It is just like whatever happens to these people.
It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder. A widespread investigation of reports from funeral homes, morgues, and hospitals has concluded that the unburied dead are coming back to life and seeking human victims.
It feels like there's a hell of a lot of kind of telling rather than showing, I suppose, in this movie. And I'm sure that's down to budgetary constraints. I just wondered, do you think that works? So there's a lot of kind of them telling each other stories of what happened to them before they get into the house. There's a whole huge monologue that Ben gives about where he had been and how he got here. And then throughout the movie, there's a lot of news reports. And that's how we know what's going on in the rest of the world. Rather than us being shown it, we're hearing it through news. You know, how does that method work for you in this film, would you say?
I find it absolutely fine, and I love the movie, and kind of, for me, it is what it is. But I can see why, especially to maybe modern viewers, that they may find it a bit slow, maybe, or a little bit tedious in places. I know that when Romero finished his cut and wanted to put it out in the world, the distributor actually kind of insisted he cut 6 minutes more dialogue out of it.
Right.
In the basement, when you have the Cooper family, there's actually a jump cut in the film, and between that jump cut, originally there was 6 more minutes of the husband and wife just sort of squabbling and talking and more discussion like that. And the reason the distributors wanted that cut is they felt it was too talky. So I think you can definitely aim that against it. But for me, it's just, you know, you just go with it. And these people and the way they talk, like we've said, is very much part of the film. So rather than come up with some clever narrative tricks to kind of get around it and show viewers more, I'm fine with them sort of catching up and just talking about what's gone down.
Me too. I love it. I think it all adds to that feeling of you're in it with, you're just trapped in this space with these people not knowing what the fuck is going on, really.
At the end of the day, like if I was in a house surviving a zombie attack and you showed up, I mean, what would we do? You'd probably tell me like how you've got to this point, where you've come from, that so-and-so almost ate you over, you know, at the greengrocers or whatever. I'd then tell you my backstory. It's kind of real, isn't it? Why not?
I love it. And, you know, I in some ways I prefer that kind of zombie story or that kind of narrative to the big World War Z global scale. God, let's look at what the government are doing. Let's look at all the different countries. Let's fly around the world and a kind of whistle-stop tour of the world almost, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I love how sort of personal this one is, and I love the way that the zombies as well, which we didn't really cover, but just during that kind of first half of the movie, you start off with one and then there's a couple more and then there's a couple and they just slowly creep up with you, don't they? And every time they look back out of the window, there's suddenly a load more. You know, it's just this like impending doom, isn't it, growing outside.
Yeah, it becomes inescapable.
Why are space experts being consulted about an Earth-bound emergency? So far, all the betting on the answer to that question centers on the recent Explorer satellite shot to Venus. That satellite, you'll recall, started back to Earth, but never got here. That's the space vehicle which orbited Venus and then was purposely destroyed by NASA when scientists discovered it was carrying a mysterious high-level radiation with it.
Now, obviously, like, I've heard George say that there is no, and maybe this is what makes this film so scary, is that it feels like there is no rhyme or reason to these zombies. Like, they just are back from the dead. I think George says something like, you probably know this better than me, but he says something like God changed the rules or something like that, I think, which is essentially like, there is no reason for this. It's just the world is changing. This is what happens now. If you die, you don't stay dead. But in the original, in this Night of the Living Dead, there are these kind of mentions, aren't there, of like, maybe this is happening because of satellites or radiation, and it feels like that's very swiftly dropped in the later films. But, you know, do you think that's him trying to, is it a respond to the kind of, I don't know, trends of all these kind of atomic or spacey horror movies out there of the 50s and 60s? I don't know.
It could be. I mean, I don't know if he was just having a bit of fun with it, and because there is a sort of satirical side to Night of the Living Dead, and I don't know if he was just sort of winding everyone up because there had been so many of those movies with sort of giant atomic beasts and you know, the whole sort of Russian-American Cold War, you know, conflict going on. So maybe it was that, or maybe, you know, the distributors wanted something put in there for a little bit, something for the audience to hang on to. I don't really know the answer to that, but I do think that when he set out to make the film originally, what he wanted to make was just a kind of revolutionary film that like Last Man on Earth, which we've talked about, based on I Am Legend. The reason he loved that is he felt that that was a film that talked about a revolution. It's like the end of society, sort of beginning again in a way, overthrowing everything. You know, such a political statement. I think that's the film he wanted to make. And, you know, the whole thing about cadavers coming back with a bit of radiation, you know, I don't think he really cared about that. I think he just chucked it in there.
Civil defense authorities have told newsmen that murder victims show evidence of having been partially devoured by their murderers. Medical examination of victims' bodies shows conclusively that the killers are eating the flesh of the people they kill.
So, you know, we get a big chunk of these characters basically stuck with each other in this house, bickering like hell, and then the murders start to happen, basically. So let's get to that. We get Tom and Judy are I think the first to be picked off, aren't they, out of the sort of group in the house. They don't get killed by the zombies. They die in that explosion, first of all, don't they? But then, obviously, we get this incredibly graphic them being eaten. And actually, I think it's about 40 minutes into the movie before we actually discover that these zombies are not only coming back from the dead and murdering, but they're also eating the flesh. And it's, again, a weird thing to think that at this point, this was a kind of shock reveal that zombies were not known for eating flesh at this point, were they? That's the thing. And again, how shocking must this moment have been for audiences? I mean...
Even watching it now, because apparently Romero went back and sort of filmed some of that later, that he decided they wanted more close-ups and more kind of shock value. Well, it certainly worked. But even now, those scenes, they're in black and white, which I think only adds to it, because if it was colour, you know, it's kind of before Dick Smith came up with his you know, blood formula. So it probably would have been day-glow red blood, which wouldn't have worked. But in black and white, they shoot it and you get real close-ups of them chomping on intestines, on like
and it's the
noises, bones, slurping, crunching, and you know it's just absolutely horrendous. I watched the film again last night, just ready for this podcast. I know you did as well. And those few seconds, it's probably 10 seconds or something of them chomping down. Again, it's still even now quite vile.
It's grotesque, isn't it? It's a bit like Texas Chainsaw, what we said about that, about how it makes you want to go vegan almost, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so
it really
gross.
does. It really does.
It's horrible. And I even love the way the music changes at this point in the film. Again, we don't have that kind of hammy score. It's this weird kind of drone. And again, it put me in mind of things like Texas Chainsaw and things that would follow it. This just kind of like dirgy noise in the background running. It feels like everything changes almost here.
And that's also the same for the scene where the little girl with the trowel kills her mother. That after this hammy score that you've had for a lot of the movie, when she kills her mother, you've got this kind of low slung shot looking up at her, like, you know, looming over the body with a trowel. And the trowel comes down and you start to hear all these amazing effects of squishing, of, you know, entering flesh. And then the screaming becomes this really weird sort of echoey wailing that again is like something out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Where it's really distorted. And it is so disturbing. It's like from a completely different movie to some of what you've been watching before.
Exactly. It's like a really fucked up version of the Psycho shower scene or something, isn't it?
It really is.
A more disturbing version of it. And again, you've got this murderous zombie wielding a trowel and stabbing rather than just eating as well. Exactly. It's really creepy. I mean, and actually, we touched upon the black and white, but like, I love the cinematography in this film as well, the lighting and the way that those kinds of scenes are shot and kind of. There are bits of it that feel a bit handheld, which feels very modern, and also kind of weird, kind of jaunted sort of angles.
He uses a lot of like tilted angles.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. I mean, just visually, the film's really kind of aggressive, and that's one of the reasons it stands up now. But I don't feel it's dated. That it's still like the cutting of it and the camera work of it is so like modern and fast in places, and and it's really choppy and kind of disorientating.
Yes, and again, going back to what we said about Texas Chainsaw, there is something that even puts you on edge about the way it's edited and the way it looks, isn't it? It's kind of subconsciously almost. And there's something about going back to the sound design as well. Something about what Neil Brand spoke to me on this podcast when we did Psycho, and he talked about how kind of music changed in horror, with things like the shower scene, and that previously with horror movie music, the score would very much be telling you the emotion, like this is horrible, isn't it? Hammer, and suddenly there was something very cold about Hitchcock's and Bernard Herrman's score in that it wasn't really giving you an emotion. It was just making the sounds of a knife almost, and it kind of feels like that, quite literally with this, isn't it? Like you say, the distorted screams is the only musical accompaniment,
it's more about intensity than anything, isn't it?
And it just works so well, and it's just the way that it's kind of slowly crept up on you, where by the time you get to this moment, it's like, what the fuck am I watching,
If I were surrounded by 6 or 8 of these things, would I stand a chance with them?
Well, there's no problem. If you had a gun, shoot them in the head. That's a sure way to kill them. If you don't, get yourself a club or a torch. Beat them or burn them. They go up pretty easy.
Well, Chief McClellan, how long do you think it will take you until you get the situation under control?
Well, that's pretty hard to say. We don't know how many of them there are. We know when we find them, we can kill them.
Are they slow-moving, Chief?
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
And then we start to get all this horrible footage of these kind of people with their dogs, these kind of these kind of rednecky types who seem to be, from the interviews, just enjoying it a bit too much, aren't they?
They really are. And again, Romero, he actually cast that from sort of local people, but it was real sort of steel workers in Pennsylvania, and apparently they came along and quite happily appeared in the movie just because they enjoyed it and had fun sort of trawling around with their guns and meat hooks, and you kind of really get that vibe. It feels authentic.
Right. And that apparently it was kind of very ad-libbed, all these interviews and stuff, when he kind of, they kind of go, oh yeah, they're all kinds of messed up, and oh yeah, you'll be fine, just shoot them in the head and all
beat
that.
Beat them and burn them.
Right. Oh, it's that now from a modern perspective is, where the movie really becomes terrifying, I think,
really
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, the last few minutes are awful.
Yeah, so let's just briefly run through then how this movie ends. So you've got, Ben is kind of the last remaining survivor in this house. He's barricaded himself in the basement, hasn't he? And then what happens after that? I mean, it's still shocking.
Yeah, well, we cut to a few outdoor scenes, and it's all very kind of still life and beautiful as much as it can be after everything that's gone down. But it's kind of dawn, it's tranquil. There's a few like tweeting birds you can hear on the soundtrack. And Ben makes his way up from the basement, and the posse are kind of closing in on the house. So you think, rescue's come, he's going to rejoin humanity. They're going to do what they have to do, go where they have to go to survive. But Ben kind of pokes his head out of the house, and the posse one of them says, oh, there's one, mistaking him for a zombie.
Yeah. Let's go check out the house. There's something there. I heard a noise. All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes. Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
And he's just shot straight in the head, falls down. That's it, dead. And then it cuts to over the end credits. You've just got this sort of still photographs, and the camera zooms in on still photographs so that you can really see the grain of them. And it's just Ben and various other people being meat hooked up and like chucked on a bonfire and then lit and burnt. And again, it's very Vietnam, and it's just really distressing, and that's the end of the movie.
And that's just how it ends.
Yeah, go home with that, kids.
Yeah, right. Just go. Yeah, that's it. That's what you're left with. And even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which we discussed last time, has more of a happy ending than this, doesn't it? It is absolutely brutal, and it still packs a punch, isn't it? I mean, it feels like it. No matter what elements of this film may have dated because of budgetary reasons or is 50 years ago, that does not feel like it's dated. That still photograph montage at the end.
No, it is absolutely appalling and absolutely shocking.
I wonder if it's and again, George wasn't thinking of race in this, but I guess it was almost just like a really dark joke, I guess, for him at the end, was it? That they thought that this last remaining guy was a zombie and shot him in the head.
Yeah, I think, again, it's maybe George's kind of bleak view of humanity. I think George loved people as well. He's a very generous-hearted guy, but I don't think he had much faith in certain people. And I think, that's just the final nail in the coffin, really, of, this is what we're capable of and we can't get along and we're a bunch of idiots, really.
Yeah, and there you go.
Come ahead with the motorcycle, please. Let's go, Master! That's the way! Hey, Randy, light these torches over here. People in the back, way in the back.
Night of the Living Dead is not what I would call a fun movie.
No.
Like, there is nothing kind of like, yay, let's all cheer and clap and laugh at this. It's a really bleak, like, George wants us to really be scared of this film, doesn't he? That's the thing.
What I find hilarious about this film as well, talking about being scared, is when it came out in, I think it was October 1968, it was before the MPAA, the ratings board in America, had formed. That formed in November the following year. So it went out to various theatres, drive-ins, etc., without a certificate, which meant anyone could go and see it. And parents took along their kids, thinking that, it's going to be your standard sort of fun horror movie with the creaky cobwebs and castles and all of that. And they went along, and there are reports, I think Roger Ebert wrote one report of this, of just the shell-shocked audiences, that kids started off the first few minutes, they were sort of giggling and eating their popcorn, and by the end, everyone was absolutely traumatised.
I mean,
as you would be.
And you really do go on that journey with it, It starts off and you kind of think, oh yeah, this is quite, fun, and then by the end, I am a bit of a, I'm shell-shocked by those last few images, It's incredible, it really does wallop you.
Night of the Living Dead.
What was the kind of reaction like? What was the initial kind of audience reaction and critical reaction and that kind of thing?
Well, a lot of the reviews when it first came out lambasted it for the gore, that, that's all they saw, and they felt, especially like I said, without the MPAA rating and the fact kids were going to see it, they felt that what the hell is this lunatic doing, that it's just socially disgraceful behaviour, kind of lock him up and all of that. And it played in drive-ins on a double bill with Doctor Who and the Daleks as well, which is amazing. Absolutely crazy.
That is amazing.
And I think Roger Ebert wrote an original review that was quite negative, and that actually had a good effect, that it got the movie out there more, that even though it was quite negative, people saw it and started watching this film. And then there was a kind of wave of support for it, but it actually appeared on Sight and Sound's top 10 movies of the year.
There you go.
That year. And then the New York Museum of Modern Art invited George Romero to come and sort of present it there. And then obviously from there it just grew and grew and grew, and over the years, and became just this iconic,
the classic,
not just iconic horror movie, just iconic movie, American movie.
Right, exactly. Exactly. I think it didn't just change things for the zombie subgenre or the horror genre. It kind of feels like it changed cinema almost, or it was the beginning of this huge change in cinema, this period.
It's also the independent spirit that we haven't talked about.
Yes.
Not just that it then opened the door for independent horror filmmakers, that you had, Blair Witch Project or whatever, all these many, many films. Yeah. But movies in general, that we had independent filmmakers, Orson Welles, when he'd been roaming across Europe, had sort of raised his own funds and made movies. And then you had obviously someone like John Cassavetes was really important for independent cinema. But as much as any of those, I think Romero making this movie for $114,000, started off, the original budget was like $6,000, and he managed to get a bit more money, making it with mates and various locals, a couple of professional actors, and just shooting it in 30 days over 7 months, when they had the money and when they had the time, doing it in black and white, making their own zombie makeup. The makeup actually he jokes about this, the makeup gets better as it goes along because they were learning it. They'd never done it before, they didn't have real makeup people. So all of that independent spirit, I mean, what an effect that's had on movies in last
incredible.
50 years.
And I think we love that kind of a story, don't we?
We do, DIY filmmaking.
Yeah, and I love the way that it kind of, it feels like you said, sight and sound, and suddenly kind of the art house circuit started to embrace it. It feels like slowly but surely,
started to take it seriously. I mean, it's often the way with these kind of movies that if it's really radical and it's shocking and it's violent and it's assaultive, people can't see past that on first viewing. That's all they take away from it. Like, what a disgrace, And then when you start to look past that, maybe on a second viewing, you start to realise just how much of interest is going on there.
Yeah, and even even you said, your first experience of it, I think sometimes it does take a couple of watches with this film to kind of completely appreciate it on every level. Yeah. And did it ever have, I mean, you said like it didn't get an MPAA rating. Did it ever have any censorship problems at all over here? I mean, like we spoke about with Texas Chainsaw at length, all the problems that had. Did this have anything like that?
It did. In 1969, the BBFC actually cut a fair amount out of it. I don't know the exact sort of, how many minutes or seconds, but the trowel scene that we've talked about with the little girl troweling her mother to death, and the flesh-eating scenes that we've talked about, which, by the way, they use real sheep intestines for some of that. God. And they decided they looked too flat. They wanted them to have more life to them, so they actually pumped them full of water. They were chowing down on real sheep's intestines, and then they had ham covered in chocolate sauce, and they had silly putty on bones. They had all of these things. Like, one of the financiers was actually a butcher. He owned a chain of butcher shops, so he provided all of the kind of offal and all of that.
Amazing.
And anyways, it was too strong for the BBFC is the point, and they cut it. And it wasn't until 1980 when the film was re-released, because Dawn of the Dead had come out and proved such a success, and it was re-released, and then it came out in England uncut and restored, and then that's the version we see today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And like you said, this was a low budget movie that became a sensation. You'd have thought that this movie should have made George Romero and everyone involved loads and loads of money, but it didn't, did it? There was a copyright fuck up with it, wasn't there?
Yeah.
It was something as simple as they just forgot to put a little copyright symbol on it or something, wasn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, basically you had to have the statement, the sort of copyright statement at the end of the film, and I think it was a distributor's forgot to put it on there, which meant that the moment the film was shown and was out there, it was in the public domain. And that is why, I'm sure you've noticed this, and I'm sure even some people who aren't massive horror nerds have noticed this, that so many horror movies, when you watch them even today, when there's a clip of them watching a horror movie, like if it's Babysitters on Halloween and they're watching a horror movie, on Halloween night, it's so many times Night of the Living Dead.
Yes.
And the reason that isn't just tipping its hat to this iconic, towering monumental film of the genre. It's because they can show that clip for free because it's in the public domain. They don't have to pay rights for it.
So fun. And there you go again, an artistic choice is actually a practical or financial choice, really. That's the thing. And you're so right. We always see clips of people watching Night of the Living Dead. Oh God.
It's funny. I mean, we mentioned Fright Fest again earlier, but I go to that every year, and I know you do, and you sit down in the space of 5 days, watch about 30 horror movies, and you can guarantee 4 or 5
you're going to see Night
of the Living Dead.
It's so
somewhere.
True. Oh,
it's hilarious.
It's so funny. I mean, I'm assuming that George has kind of done a right for himself since this movie, but that must have been quite gutting for them in a way. Yeah. So let's just talk briefly going forward about its kind of legacy then. I mean, what's really interesting is that I know that the other screenwriter on it, is it John Russo? Didn't he do a kind of version of this where he added some scenes in or something?
There is a version with added scenes, yeah. I mean, this is the other thing, because it was out in the public domain.
Yeah.
It meant that a lot of people could sort of get their fingers on it and recut it. There's various sort of TV versions over the years and different edits of the film, But John Russo did, and he did it, and he sort of added scenes which I think are absolutely awful. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I've not seen it. I've heard all about it, and I've heard how they basically kind of ruin any of the kind of ambiguity, I suppose, of the original.
And it has this kind of whole prologue to it, which the black and white doesn't even match. It's far more professional, sort of silvery, glamorous black and white. And it's just totally needless. So he did that version. We've obviously got all of Romero's sequels.
Yeah,
he did 5 more. Although for me, it's only the first 2.
Yes,
Dawn of the Dead and obviously Day of the Dead.
I like to think of it as just a trilogy.
Classic. It's a trilogy.
Yeah.
Let's look at it that way. And then obviously the modern day zombie movie, like we touched on earlier, which is just everywhere now. It's all down to George. It opened that door.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. And it's interesting that he never even set out to make a quote unquote zombie movie. That's just what it became. I suppose that's so often the way. That's how these things begin, isn't it? Amazing. Well, this is one more question. You've kind of already answered this for me, I think, at the beginning. But I'm asking everyone, what's your favourite zombie movie? Is it Night of the Living Dead?
Well, yeah, I mean, for years, when I was growing up, it was definitely Dawn of the Dead for the reasons I spoke about. It's the most fun. I used to watch it again and again. I found it hilarious, entertaining, great gore, blah, blah, blah. And then as I got older, Night of the Living Dead probably became my number one. It's just, there's so much going on in it. It's so intense. It just really gets you to the core even now. And I just think, and also when you take on board everything it did, or everything we talked about today, what it did for the genre and for zombies and for independent filmmaking and all of that, there's just so much to it that I think it has to be the greatest zombie movie ever made.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we talked to the, people are getting zombie fatigue at the moment. I feel like maybe we haven't had a good one in a while, a good, really original one. I mean, I wonder whether we need a little bit like it feels like we had a bit of a break from the slasher for a long time. Maybe we're still in that break, I don't know, but I wonder if we need that with the zombies, like a little bit of time away from them maybe for a bit.
I think we do. Every year there's a couple of interesting ones, and there's been a few sort of not great ones but very, very good ones over the last few years, like Train to Busan. There's a film called The Battery, which is like an American zombie movie, which is really good. Pontypool, which you mentioned, which does something new because it's kind of passed on, the virus is passed on through language. It's really clever. It's got lots of ideas, just set in a radio station. It's very contained, claustrophobic. They're all really good zombie movies, but at the same time, I wouldn't say any of them are great zombie movies, as in all-time keepers. And I kind of feel there's been so many of them in the last 10 years that, maybe we do need a little break, or maybe fashion needs to move on to something else and then come back to them.
Exactly. Well, there we go. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me once again. It's been wonderful. And, again, this is the sort of film we probably could sit here for another 5 hours, but we're going to have to wrap things up. Just tell me, where can people, if people out there want to sort of find stuff you've done online or follow you on social media, that kind of thing, where can they find you?
Basically, on social media, Twitter's probably the best bet. I'm Jamie_Graham9. And then I'm editor-at-large for Total Film magazine, so that comes out every 4 weeks on the dot. My writing's always in there. Online, you can get some of my reviews on Games Radar, which hosts Total Films reviews, so just go on there and look up stuff. And then I write for Sunday Times Culture quite a lot, so on a Sunday, sort of when it's supplement day, you often see my name in there, and then various other kind of websites. Just Google it, but if you could be bothered.
Love it. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, and a big thank you to my guest, Jamie Graham. Always such a treat to have him on the podcast, lending his incredible, vast knowledge of the genre. So, what do you think of Night of the Living Dead? Is it deserving of all of the praise and acclaim and accolades that movie has? Or is it a little bit overrated? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. We're also on Letterboxd. Letterboxd, and that's where you can find out what movies we're going to be covering in depth this series, so you can keep up to date and watch the movies in advance. That's at Evolution Pod on Letterboxd. There is also a discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. And don't forget, if you want to become a patron of the Evolution of Horror, you can donate $5 a month to help us defray the costs of making this podcast, and for that you will be treated to bonus episodes on a regular basis. You'll be sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and you'll also be offered discounts on Evolution of Horror merchandise due to launch very soon. So if you want to get involved, just visit patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. And don't forget, you can find every single episode of this podcast, as well as bonus episodes, as well as written reviews and blogs, all on our website. That's evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Libsyn, Podbean, and various others. And if you do get the chance, please do leave us a little rating or review, preferably a nice positive one. It helps the podcast get boosted in algorithms, and it helps us get discovered by new listeners. And that's it for now. So, after Night of the Living Dead, where do we go from here? Well, we are venturing into the mid-1970s to discuss an equally important director and his impact on the horror genre. A Canadian director called David Cronenberg. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Rosie Fletcher, and we are going to be discussing Shivers from 1976 and Rabid from 1977. We're going to be talking about these movies in depth. We're going to be talking about body horror and its connection to the zombie and infected genres, and we're going to be talking about how these movies may have influenced and impacted on the zombie subgenre. Very, very exciting. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.